Of Maduro facing trial in New York. In the same city, the United Nations Security Council is meeting on the very same topic of Venezuela. Let's cut across to that.
Endanger the finding themselves in this delicate situation. They must be the absolute priority. We have learned from our experience that the civilian population is always the one that pays the highest price in armed conflict. Mr. President, Latin America and the Caribbean have proclaimed themselves to be a zone of peace, and this collective commitment and will of our region must be respected. Unilateral action that is contrary to international law endangers regional stability, increases insecurity, and worsens the already complex conditions being faced by the civilian population, with devastating effects that will transcend the sovereign borders of Venezuela to have a direct impact on countries of the region, such as Colombia. In order to act preventively, Colombia has engaged in measures to protect the civilian population and preserve the stability of the border, addressing the possible needs of the population, particularly the migrant population, in coordination with local authorities. Colombia has been and will continue to be show solidarity in receiving the Venezuelan people who, given the uncertainty created by these attacks, this may lead to a massive outflow of migration, which will require significant efforts in terms of resources and capacities to provide the necessary support and assistance to those areas affected by taking in the migrants. Mr. President, these actions that we have seen remind us of the worst interference in our area in the past, in our zone of peace. And it calls to mind the commitment that we have as states to resolve our differences peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement, in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly a country that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, what then is the role of this council, and where are the foundations for international peace and security? We are accepting that the law and the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber. Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence or coercion, and it cannot be superseded either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law, through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity, and dignity. with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law, and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, our good offices available.
Colombia there raising its concerns after the the capture and the United States striking inside Venezuela, its neighbor in Latin America, of course. The United States, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which means that any action decided, if there is action decided to be taken on it today, the United States can veto it. This is, of course, showing a real conundrum, of course, which the United Nations is in. And joining me now to discuss this is Mark Sutherland, a geopolitical commentator. He joins me live from London. And Keith Vaz joins me too, a former British minister, joining live from Dubai. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on the programme. Of course, multilateralism has been in question over the past few months, particularly during the Trump administration 2.0. Questions over international law and countries working together linger, and the capability of the United Nations when it comes to issues. However, what happened 2 days ago was unprecedented. It has divided the world. Mark, can I get your initial thoughts on this meeting? What might transpire and the possible outcomes?
Thomas, good to be with you and your guest. I have to be honest and say, while I'm sitting here, try not to be too cynical, that what that particular statement from the UN Security Council, I'm assuming, from Colombia rather, is that they actually need to look at the whole voting process that has gone in regard to Venezuela over many, many years. And there was an election last year, which Maduro did not win. He had actually banished the opposition leader, had to leave the country. Another man then stood in her place. I believe she is in Madrid. Both their names have gone completely from my memory. So we have to look at the security. When these people say democracy, well, as long as the democracy then goes their way. Now, this is particularly uncomfortable. You and I discussed this partly yesterday. There is narco-terrorism in that area. Whether some people may not face that in regard to Hamas, Hezbollah, there is movements from China, Russia, etc. So this is
Yes.
what all this is on the table, Thomas. So
Mark, apologies to interrupt. We now have the Russian Federation are now speaking, a long-term ally of Venezuela. We're going to listen to that.
The confirmed reports about the presence of the abducted president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in the United States. Today, as we are aware, they are in New York. We call upon, corrects the speaker, the U.S. leadership to immediately release. Washington's aggressive acts have already been condemned by many states and multilateral associations, including the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Union, as well as a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We hope that the international banditry will immediately be met with objective and comprehensive assessment at the international legal level, with United Nations, universal mechanisms, and other multilateral formats being brought to bear. This process must not be impacted by the recognition or non-recognition by any given states or groups of states of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro. For this reason, unintelligible murmurings and attempts to avoid principled assessments by those who, in other circumstances, froth at the mouth and demand that others respect the UN Charter, today seem particularly hypocritical and unseemly. We hope you will recognize this, and we hope that you will abandon double standards and that you will not attempt to justify such an egregious act of aggression due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela's natural resources and the assertion of their hegemonical.
The Russian Federation speaking there, of course, reaffirming their alliance with Nicolas Maduro and what they called a legitimate elected leader in Venezuela. Keith, I want to get your viewpoint on this. Of course, the United Nations Security Council, highly polarized. The world has been split down the middle, with some fluctuating around the center, not trying not to say certain words. However, the majority of the international community has voiced their opinion. They certainly have a camp when it comes to this situation. Can I get your outlook on the actions which are probably going to happen here, the outcomes of this session, and of course the weakness of the United Nations, which this situation unveils?
Good evening, Thomas from Dubai. You're absolutely right. This is a unprecedented piece of history in a world when people should be prepared to be shocked about events happening in different parts of the world. This is unbelievable that the world's one of the most important democracies in the world, a country that leads by example, the Constitution of the United States, quoted so many times in so many different contexts. It's a mirror for the world. They are the leaders of the free world. To go and invade another country and to abduct the elected president and his wife, and then to say we're only doing it because we want the oil. This oil is our stolen oil. We will bring our own companies in to administer the oil, and we'll eventually hand this back to the Venezuelan people. So I don't think that you can take the unprecedented act on its own, the abduction on its own, without the words of President Trump. This is why we did it. Yes, he's been charged with narco-terrorism. I don't know about the facts of the charge, but for any country to do the same, we would be condemning, including my own country, the United Kingdom, would be condemning those countries. Russia, of course, you've just had the statement by the Russian permanent member of the Security Council, is basically saying, well, when other people do similar things, there's frothing at the mouth and condemnation. Why is there not condemnation here? The most interesting development is the comments by the Vice President and the fact that she has now said that she will work with the Americans. I just get this feeling, Thomas, that maybe this is a plan that was hatched all along. Maduro just leaving. I mean, those of you won't remember this, Thomas, you're far too young, but the assassination of Salvador Allende in Chile, how that ended. This was a man abducted from the presidential palace. Does he not have any police officers outside? Does he not know this is going to happen? Because he did say to the Americans, come and get me, which is what they did. So international law will never, ever be the same again after what has happened today. This goes beyond Grenada, it goes beyond Vietnam, all those other countries. This is terrible because the reason is given for the oil that the Americans believe belonged to them. I mean, I don't know how the world can be divided on this. It should be united in condemnation.
Keith, thank you very much. Do stay with us. We're hearing from China now.
the international community has repeatedly expressed grave concern over the U.S. sanctions, blockade, and threats of force against Venezuela. The Council convened 2 emergency meetings, during which Secretary General Guterres, many Council members, and countries in the region and beyond unanimously called for abiding by the UN Charter and the international law, maintaining calm and restraint, resolving disputes peacefully, de-escalating tensions, and safeguarding regional stability. However, as a permanent member of the Council, the U.S. has disregarded the grave concerns of the international community, wantonly trampled upon Venezuela's sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests, and seriously violated the principles of sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, peaceful settlement of international disputes, and the prohibition of the use of force in international relations. These principles constitute the fundamental tenets of the UN Charter and form the cornerstone of maintaining international peace and security. The U.S. has placed its own power above multilateralism and military action above diplomatic efforts, posing a grave threat to peace and security in Latin America and the Caribbean, and indeed internationally. China firmly opposes this, and the international community has also expressed widespread grave concern and strong condemnation. We urge the U.S. to heed the overwhelming voice of the international community, abide by international law and the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, cease infringing upon the sovereignty and security of other countries, stop toppling the government of Venezuela, and return to the path of political solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We call on the U.S. to ensure the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife and to release them at once. We support the Council in fulfilling its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and we support all efforts by the UN Secretary General, regional countries, and organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue and de-escalating the situation. President, the lessons of history are a stark warning. Military means are not the solution to problems, and the indiscriminate use of force will only lead to greater crisis. The U.S. bypassed the Council to launch military operations against Iraq, blatantly attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, and imposed economic sanctions, military strikes, and even armed occupations on multiple countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. These actions have caused persistent conflict, instability, and immense suffering for the ordinary people. Did these actions bring peace and stability? Did they bring development and prosperity? The international community sees this clearly. Venezuela.
You hear China there speaking once again. We are, just for those who have just joined, we are covering the UNSC meet which Venezuela has convened after the capture of Nicolas Maduro by the United States. And China is now speaking, of course, a long-time ally of Venezuela and a long-time ally of Nicolas Maduro, its biggest customer for oil exports. Mark, of course, we heard once again China slamming the United States for what they are calling bullying, once again bringing examples of past foreign policy into the chamber that brought in the likes of Iran and Iraq and emphasized the damage that it has on the ordinary people of these countries. Venezuela, of course, we're very early in the humanitarian and power vacuum it's yet to see how this is going to play out. Mark, your thoughts on the Chinese perspective there? Of course, we hear a similar perspective from Russia, a long-time economic trader of Venezuela, the same with Russia, who said exactly the same thing. Once again, slamming the United Nations and the leadership, and unilateral bullying, what it calls from the United States. What are your thoughts on those statements, Mark?
Thomas, why am I surprised in regard to their reactions? We don't really have time to go back to the overthrow of the Shah in 1979 by the Trilateral Commission, etc., and the red-green axis. But all of this is, to me, is then playing out yet again ideologically. It's all very well China making a comment in regard to the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities, the present regime with spending all this money in regard to that. We will arm ourselves with a nuclear bomb and take out Israel and bring our Mahdi in. This has to be said. All of these ideologies, this is what we are then dealing with. The number one thing, I hear the comments about where President Trump has turned around and said this is about oil, but actually it's what is going on in the American backyard that they are then not happy with. And you and I, with also your other esteemed guest, would need far more time to go through history. We may not agree. We may not agree on that. But sound bites, that's all we can deal with. But I am not surprised by the reaction from the Russian Federation. Maybe they need to talk about what they've been doing in Ukraine. So there is an element of kettle black, etc., within this, Thomas, in my humble opinion. To you.
And Keith, I want to bring you in here. Of course, before this session started, the UN Secretary General voiced his concerns that international law is no longer respected. Of course, the United Nations, founded by international liberal democracies after World War II. Do you think the UN Secretary General has a right to be concerned there, given the fact that two permanent members, the United States and Russia, are currently now huge proponents of what some people are saying is shatters the UN Charter?
Well, I think one of the problems has been, Thomas, that the people who've led the UN have been people chosen by consensus. With the greatest respect to Mr. Guterres, who I had dealings with when I was Minister for Europe in the UK, I don't think he's been a very effective Secretary General. I think the institution has failed miserably over the years, and that is why Donald Trump is taking no notice of it. It's sad and embarrassing that a country like China, which is not a democracy, should be, of course, lecturing the rest of the world and telling people about democracy and international law. But to be fair to the Chinese, they've got Taiwan on their doorstep. There's always been saber rattling, but Taiwan, at least for the time being, is an independent country. Now that the Americans have done this, does this provide more opportunity for other countries to do exactly the same, remove people they don't want and put them in their place? This is what might happen. This is what is being allowed. That's why for the European Union, so often the bastion of democracy and liberal thinking, as we know, this is a crossroads. If they criticize Donald Trump, then they get their tariffs increased, and they don't get any of the oil that he's going to produce in Venezuela. This world is now upside down. I have to tell you, Thomas, I dread watching the news every. Obviously, NewsX is one of my favorite programs, but I dread. What could happen next? What can you do after this? After you, whether it's, I mean, I take Mark's point. This is the backyard of America, but that does not give them the right, Mark, to go into every country in South America and start taking them over. Does the United Kingdom, you're sitting there with your Union Jack, quite rightly proud to be British, does this give us a right to go and invade Ireland, remove the Prime Minister and put someone else there as the Taoiseach, exactly like we did before Ireland became independent? Everyone can now do anything to anybody, and no one is going to be able to say a word. This is a massive line in the sand. I would never have predicted it. The threats to Cuba, the threats to Mexico, the threats to Greenland, for goodness sake. Denmark is part of NATO. If Greenland is attacked, it means that the other NATO countries have to come to Denmark's defense. We're going to end up with a war after all this, I'm telling you. And I'm the last person to want this. I think all of us need to step back, okay? Step back from this and try and restore order. If this doesn't happen, it is going to end in a war.
Mark, I want to bring you in once again here. Of course, many analysts have said that this does set a dangerous precedent. A lot of people citing Taiwan as the prime example for that. Apologies. The United States are now speaking at the UNSC meeting.
Mr. Freitas, for your briefing. And I'll point out that Mr. Freitas is in exile, having fled the regime. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for shedding a light on the true atrocities of the illegitimate Maduro regime. This past weekend, colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega. He was arrested, indicted, convicted in a court of law, served in prison in the United States and in Panama, and the Panamanian people, the American people, are safer for it. And undeniably, the region was more stable. This law enforcement action was directed consistent with the President of the United States' responsibility as Commander-in-Chief to protect Americans at home and abroad against a fugitive who is directly responsible for narco-terrorism that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and created destabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges for his involvement in a wide-ranging conspiracy to conduct narco-terrorism, to traffic cocaine and other drugs, and conducting international weapons trafficking. The overwhelming evidence of his crimes will be presented openly in U.S. court proceedings. Colleagues, Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He was an illegitimate so-called president. He was not a head of state. For years, Maduro and his cronies have manipulated Venezuela's electoral system to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short of the most basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credible elections. If the UN and the United Nations in this body confers legitimacy on an illegitimate narco-terrorist and the same treatment in this charter of a democratically elected president or head of state, what kind of organization is this? We should note that over 50 countries, many nations, including the European Union, including a number of Latin American countries in the region, and of course the United States, again, over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 elections and do not recognize him as Venezuela's legitimately elected president. Maduro unlawfully refused to peacefully cede power after the Venezuelan people voted him out of office in the 2024 election. So therefore, Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He is the head of a vicious foreign terrorist organization, Cartel de los Soles. This regime-sponsored enterprise coordinates with and relies on other vicious criminal organizations, namely Tren de Aragua, again, among others, to carry out its objective of using illegal narcotics as a weapon against the United States. And for its part, Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization with thousands of members, many of whom have unlawfully infiltrated the United States and are conducting irregular warfare and undertaking hostile actions against the American people and against the United States. It's terrorizing criminals commit brutal crimes, including murders, kidnappings, extortions, and human, drug, and weapons trafficking. This administration, President Trump, will not stand for it. In fact, in March of 2025, President Trump declared that Tren de Aragua is quote, Tren de Aragua is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco-terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials, and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere for illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including Those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
There we hear it. Mike Waltz speaking on behalf of the United States at the United Nations Security Council in response to the capturing of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who is being held just down the street in New York, facing a judge on U.S. soil. Mark, let's start with you. What were your thoughts about Mike Waltz's speech there? Of course, the talking points, of course, the Trump administration saying that they offered diplomacy to Maduro prior to this operation. Do you think that's going to, what kind of impact do you think that had?
Well, obviously the impact it had was not what the Americans were offering, because he'd never decided to take any offers of any off-ramp, as the Americans would say, over the last 6 months. I am not surprised by what Mike Waltz has said, because in my own research, yes, the issue is, it's not just about oil. The issue is what's happening in the American backyard in regard to all the drug trafficking and who raises money out of that, and then what the terrorist activities then use that money for to then carry out. And we have to look at Hamas and Hezbollah in that respect. Plus, just finally, Thomas, just to remember that under the Biden regime over the last 4 years, before President Trump came back in his second administration, there has been millions and millions of illegal immigrants crossing over the border. America is then concerned who was within their own country, like the UK is and needs to be more so, frankly. So all of these issues are playing out here, Thomas, as you and I have recently discussed in the past. To you.
Yes, Matthew Vadum joins us also. He's an American journalist and he joins us live from Washington, D.C. to discuss this further. Matthew, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us. Of course, we've just heard Mike Waltz speak at the United Nations. He said that all avenues were offered to Maduro, and he also said that this is not a war with Venezuela or its people, despite there is a huge armada waiting outside in the Caribbean Sea, as Donald Trump likes to put it. Of course, the future of this situation does remain uncertain. However, as of now, of course, the main debate is over international law, the credibility of it. If you've just seen Mike Waltz's speech there, what did you think about it? And does this set a precedent now that going into a sovereign nation and kidnapping someone who you deem as a national security threat is warranted under international law?
Well, I would be careful about the use of the word kidnapping. Maduro, under American law, Nicolas Maduro was under indictment. He's still under indictment in the Southern District of New York Judicial District. So kidnapping isn't quite whose behavior it has deemed injurious to the United States. The U.S. believes not only that Maduro is a narco trafficker and the head of a drug cartel, but he is a terroristic drug cartel. But he he's wanted for these crimes in the United States. So, the United States did this, and the concept of international law really isn't very. The precepts of international law really aren't very useful here, because they're not enforceable. International law is largely fantasy land, and it doesn't count for very much. The United States, this is the world of realpolitik. The United States has the power to do this, and it did it, and nobody is going to stop the United States. This was largely a power play against the People's Republic of China. It was intended to send a message to the People's Republic of China that you cannot exercise. You cannot do anything that you want to do in the Western Hemisphere. That is the United States sphere of influence. Donald Trump has revitalized the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which said that European powers would not be able to set up colonial enterprises in the Americas, meaning North America, Central America, and South America. So, international law is an interesting debating point here, but it really doesn't.
As the non-legitimate winner of the 2024 election. Of course, there are serious humanitarian concerns in Venezuela, which Maduro's poorly run regime and corruption, among other things, have seen to be the cause of. Of course, we also heard those statements that says there is no war against Venezuela and its people, just Nicolas Maduro as an individual and some of his accomplices that are part of a wider network that is a US national security threat. What do you think of some of those talking points? Okay. Apologies. Mark, now to you next.
I can answer that, Thomas. Thank you. I think Keith had to go. Well, I fully concur with what every single thing that what Matthew has said, and thank you for his comments. America has always raised the issue of, of certain people have said, why is the UN even on their soil? What good is it actually doing? In my own humble opinion, but Matthew raises the fact that, as we've said, this is America's backyard, but also, as Matthew's talked about, also the whole thing of narco-terrorism is what do these terrorists do, and where do they take their money? We only have to see is what Iran has been doing. We have to see what Hamas has been doing in regard to the invasion of Israel on the 7th of October 2023. This is an ideological battle that is going on, and I completely agree with what Matthew has said, which is turning around and saying this is a huge punch in regard to the China direction. Remember, China had a group of Chinese diplomats over there at the same time, and they then snatched Maduro under their nose as well. No matter how much anti-aircraft technology they've actually put in there, along with Russia, doesn't seem to have worked. But the key is this: is that within the suited community, I say this respectfully, within all these people that call themselves diplomats, and as Matthew has said, a parlor discussion, this is about real world politique. And other countries need to learn that we are countries with national borders. Within the UK, unfortunately, we have a prime minister that is learnt he calls himself an international lawyer, and all of these other issues, and not respecting our own borders. One of the reasons why so many people's nose has been put out of joint, whether you like him or not, is that President Trump has turned around and said, I've taken action, whether you like it or not. I will stand up for my country. I'll just say this finally. It's all over Twitter. It's all over. It's been there for many years. There are huge concerns in regard to the previous president before Maduro, and in regard to the legality of elections and what machines you use and how you conduct those. This is not conspiracy theory. There is so much out there, and it also relates to the American election of 2020. Matthew and I don't have time to discuss that. But this is the uncomfortable thing, and with great respect, when people turn around and talk about, democracy within the European Union and all this kind of thing, we only have to refer to to what's happened in Romania, where they wanted an election, and then, according to European ministers, no, you can't put this person forward to stand in a Romanian election. There is so much that's being revealed here that is sticking in people's throats, because they're actually having to think about how they run their own elections. Within the UK, as far as I'm concerned, we need to get rid of postal votes. Ballot stuffing, postal votes in regard to the 2020 American election was a huge issue, and we're about to come up to the anniversary of January the 6th tomorrow. These things are uncomfortable for people to discuss, because many people politically make a heck of a lot of money and a benefit out of pushing the system in their direction. Sorry, Thomas.
That's all right. But precedent here. Do you not think precedent and if the United States, if another nation did something much like this, arrested someone else, someone that they deemed a national security threat on foreign soil, how do you think the international community would react if it wasn't the United States? If it was Russia, if it was China, what would happen?
Well, you're making a very good point. I'll throw something else out there. Of course, we can look at the history of Guatemala in 1954 and the United Fruit Company via the CIA overturning a government then. That has to be owned as well, along with North, Reagan, etc. There are certain things that, of course, the CIA and other bodies have been up to. Of that, there is no doubt, and these people have to be held to account. But you are right. Maybe if people then went in and arrested Putin, how would we then feel about that?
Yes,
I hear you, but as Matthew says, it's within the Constitution of the United States, which, frankly, on this side of the pond, that's why the Monroe Doctrine is there, now adopted as the Don Roe Doctrine. There's a lot of history.
I do want to bring Matthew back in finally. Does the Constitution of the United States, which has the Monroe Doctrine in it from 1823, trump the UN Charter, Matthew?
The Constitution does not contain the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was President James Monroe making a policy statement saying U.S. will not permit Europe to have colonies in the Americas, but just the Constitution permits the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, in this case, the current president, Donald Trump, to take actions to defend the United States. Now, this is subject only to the limitation that Congress can insist on a declaration of war, or as it did in previous engagements, like after 9/11, on an authorization, a resolution authorizing the use of military force. So Congress can impose restrictions. It has not done so with respect to Venezuela, and it probably won't, especially because the major action has already taken place in Venezuela. Maduro was snatched and grabbed, and he's now in New York City, enjoying the fine hospitality of the jailers there. And the Constitution, this is an arguable point. The Constitution allows the president to act decisively to defend the United States. If Congress wants to intervene and clip his wings, so to speak, he can do that. My guess is it will not do that with respect to Venezuela.
Do you think the United States still respects the United Nations international law? I'll ask you bluntly, Matthew.
I think that the United States government respects international law to the extent that it does not interfere with the United States government's obligation to defend the national security of the United States. if the two are in conflict, I think the United States will do what it thinks is right.
I do apologise, Matthew. Denmark are indeed speaking now, so we're going to go to them.
Imperative is enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Members of the UN Security Council have a special responsibility to uphold these principles. The principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. The inviolability of borders is not up for negotiation. These are universal, sacrosanct principles enshrined in international law. They apply everywhere. Mr. President, once again, Denmark calls on all parties to urgently de-escalate tensions that could threaten peace and stability in the region and beyond. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, as stated in the UN Charter. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to engage in dialogue and diplomacy. Denmark takes note of official statements from the United States government stating that the military operations are to combat drug trafficking and stem the illicit flow of illegal narcotics. Denmark shares the priority of combating organized crime and drug trafficking, while reiterating that counter-narcotic efforts, as all other efforts, must be conducted in strict accordance with international law, including the fundamental rules and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, against this backdrop, Denmark wishes to recall our solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Denmark does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela following the lack of transparency and integrity in the 2024 presidential elections, which failed to meet basic democratic standards. In Maduro's attempts to cling to power, his authoritarian regime grew increasingly oppressive. His regime bears responsibility for widespread and systematic violations of human rights against his fellow citizens, and he should be held accountable. The victims of the Maduro regime's alleged crimes against humanity have to be heard. The Venezuelan people have a right to democracy and self-determination exercised through peaceful, inclusive, and credible democratic processes, free from fear of political persecution, intimidation, or repression, and external political interference. This includes the rights of Venezuelans alone to determine their political, economic, and social future without coercion, pressure, or manipulation by external actors. No state should seek to influence political outcomes in Venezuela through the use or threat of force or through other means inconsistent with international law. Venezuela's future can be decided only by the Venezuelans. We call on all parties and stakeholders to come together for a negotiated and peaceful transition to democratic rule in a process led by and owned by Venezuelans. At this critical and uncertain time, it is imperative that all parties fully respect human rights and international law. Denmark remains committed to supporting Venezuela and the aspirations of its people on its path to lasting political stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Somalia on the assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of January. And I thank our briefers for their remarks. Colleagues, the Venezuelan people have suffered for years. This Council now meets at a pivotal moment for Venezuela's future. Maduro's actions created extreme levels of poverty, violent repression, and failing basic services. His regime's rule precipitated a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom has long been clear that Maduro's claim to power was fraudulent. To date, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections, And independent domestic and international reports also observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. President, the United Kingdom wants to see a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. They deserve a government which reflects their vote at the ballot box and delivers a more stable, prosperous future for all Venezuelans. Finally, President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. First and foremost, I wish to congratulate you upon your presidency of the Security Council during the month of January. I also wish to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo for having conveyed to us the information from the Secretary General of the United Nations on the recent developments which have taken place in Venezuela. Mr. President, France has continued to stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people as they face the crisis that has been plaguing them for far too many years. Specifically, and in particular, since the summer of 2024, on the 20th of July, 2024, the Venezuelan people exercised their right to vote peacefully in order to shape the future of their country. Their right to choose their leaders, nonetheless, has been stripped away from the people by Nicolas Maduro. Must we recall the facts? The electoral process has been was marred by numerous irregularities, and the final counting of votes was marred by a flagrant lack of transparency. In light of the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people, Nicolas Maduro has systematically responded with the repression of dissident voices, of members of the opposition, and of civil society, as well as with numerous arbitrary detentions. France has always expressed itself with clarity about the fact that these practices are unacceptable and that respect for human rights must be upheld. Mr. President, the military operation which has led to the capture of Nicolas Maduro runs counter to the principle of peaceful dispute resolution and runs counter to the principle of non-use of force. The proliferation of violations of the Charter of the United Nations and of violations of international law by states vested with responsibility as permanent members of the Security Council chips away at the very foundation of the international order. Contravening the principles of the Charter, including the principle of respect for independence and the territorial integrity of states, undermines the foundation of the United Nations and weakens international peace and security. France remains faithful and committed to respect for the Charter of the United Nations and of the principle of peaceful dispute resolution. We have an obligation to uphold these principles at all times and in all places. Respect for these principles is indispensable. Mr. President, France wishes to reiterate our commitment to respect for the will of the Venezuelan people. The transition which is currently being opened up for Venezuela needs to be peaceful and democratic and carried out in a manner which respects the choice of the Venezuelan people, a sovereign people. This transition must be led by and for the Venezuelans. France stands ready, alongside states in the region and our partners at the European Union, to uphold dialogue with a view to the restoration of the free, democratic expression in Venezuela. We stand ready to support regional stability. This also needs to be the role of the Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
سيد الرئيس أود بداية
Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate first and foremost the Federal Republic of Somalia on its presidency of the Security Council during this month of January. We wish you every success. We also wish to take this opportunity to thank delegations whose mandate at the Council ended, namely Algeria, Guyana, the Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, as well as Slovenia. We wish to thank them for their significant contributions to the attainment of the goals and the mission of the Council. I also wish to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, for her valuable briefing related to the latest developments which have taken place at in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I wish to thank other briefers as well. We appreciate the reaffirmation by His Excellency the Secretary General of the United Nations, reaffirmation of the commitment to the fundamental principles of the Charter of the United Nations, a commitment to the peaceful diplomatic resolution of disputes. The Kingdom of Bahrain supports the call of the Secretary General for all stakeholders in Venezuela to engage in inclusive dialogue which guarantees respect for international law, and this in order to ease tensions, to preserve regional stability, and to avoid any potential adverse repercussions for security and stability in the region. The Kingdom of Bahrain also extends its support for efforts undertaken at the regional and international levels in order to reduce tensions and to enhance diplomatic means in order to provide for international peace and security. The Kingdom stresses the importance of the promotion of international cooperation in order to support all regional and international efforts which are geared towards combating international organized crime, trafficking in drugs, as well as scourges which are related to this. This undermines the stability of societies, undermines achievement of sustainable development. Therefore, these issues need to be dealt with in accordance with international relevant conventions. By way of conclusion, the Kingdom of Bahrain reaffirms our support for regional and international efforts to achieve a political, lasting solution in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. This needs to be achieved through regional cooperation and with respect for national sovereignty. The goal is to provide for security and stability in Venezuela, to avoid risks of conflict and division, to protect civil peace, and to contribute to the preservation of regional security and stability, as well as international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by congratulating Somalia on its assumption of the presidency for this month and assuring you of my delegation's full support and cooperation. We welcome the new members joining the Council. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for reading out the remarks of the Secretary General and the valuable briefing. We also take note of the views shared by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela alongside the representatives of other countries from the region and beyond in the meeting. Mr. President, Pakistan views the recent developments in Venezuela with profound concern. In a world already beset by multiple crises, escalating tensions and instability in the Caribbean do not augur well for regional and international peace and security. The UN Charter enjoins us to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The UN Charter also binds member states to sovereign equality, non-interference in the internal affairs of others, and settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. Unilateral military action contravenes these sacrosanct principles and the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Such actions set dangerous precedents that risk eroding the foundations of the global legal framework. They also fuel instability, which, as history has shown time and again, can lead to unpredictable and uncontrollable outcomes for years to come. Mr. President, at this critical juncture, the path forward must be one of dialogue and diplomacy. Durable solutions to political differences can only be found through peaceful means, with full respect for the will of the Venezuelan people, free from any external interference. We hope that Latin American and the Caribbean region as a zone of peace will remain free from conflict and confrontation and continue its march towards enhanced regional cooperation and improved prosperity for the people. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, de-escalate tensions, pursue peaceful coexistence, refrain from any actions that could exacerbate the volatile situation, and engage in dialogue, including by utilizing the sincere offers of mediation. The good offices of the Secretary General also always remain available for that purpose. Lastly, Mr. President, I affirm Pakistan's commitment to contributing constructively to the discharge of the Security Council's primary responsibility for addressing the threat to international peace and security by diffusing tensions, promoting pacific settlement, and upholding respect for international law and the UN Charter. Peace and stability of Venezuela and the welfare and prosperity of its people, with full ownership, must be the overriding objective of all efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia for assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of January, and I would like to welcome the newly elected members joining the Council. I would also like to thank USG Di Carlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, as well as Mr. Sachs and Ms. De Freitas for their remarks. Mr. President, Greece is closely monitoring developments in Venezuela. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to refrain from actions that would deepen the crisis and undermine prospects for peace and stability. Greece reiterates that the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including human rights law, must always be respected. We also recall the obligation of all parties to protect civilians, especially in times of heightened tensions. Greece shares the priority of combating transnational organized crime and drug trafficking, which pose a significant security threat worldwide. We reiterate that these challenges should be addressed through sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Mr. President, Greece firmly believes that dialogue and diplomacy are the only viable tools for a peaceful transition and a sustainable resolution of the crisis. We join the Secretary General in encouraging all actors in Venezuela to engage in inclusive and meaningful dialogue in full respect of human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. We have long been clear that Nicolas Maduro's and illegitimate president's claim to power lacks legitimacy. Greece has not recognized the results of the rigged elections of July 28, 2024, and has always supported initiatives aimed at achieving a democratic solution for Venezuela. We stand firmly with the people of Venezuela in their pursuit of a democratic future, and we express the hope that the recent events will lead to this effect. The voices of all Venezuelans need to be heard, and they deserve governance that reflects their will through peaceful and inclusive processes. In this spirit, we will continue to support efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful, negotiated transition that ensures the will of all Venezuelans is fully respected. Greece stands ready to support all regional and international efforts aimed at the peaceful resolution of the crisis in line with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for this statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before coming to the substance of our statement today, I think we need to make an institutional clarification. We note with concern that an attempt is being made to present to the Security Council a supposed representative of civil society, a person whose public career trajectory bears the hallmarks of sustained funding from foreign governments and transnational corporations. This has been the case for years, as well as participation in processes of political destabilization and the promotion of institutional breakdown in her own country. The instrumental use of this person to legitimize narratives of confrontation, justify the use of force, or minimize violations of international law does not contribute in any way to the purposes of this Council or to the strengthening of multilateralism. On the contrary, it erodes the credibility of the debates and distorts the Security Council's mandate entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, on January 3rd, 2026 is a date of profound historical significance, not only for Venezuela, but for the international system as a whole. On that day, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was the target of an illegitimate armed attack lacking any legal justification by the government of the United States of America, which included bombing of our territory, the loss of civilian and military lives, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, essential infrastructure, and the kidnapping of the constitutional president of the Republic, Nicolas Maduro Moras, and the First Lady, Cilia Flores. Venezuela comes before this Council today with a deep conviction that international peace can only be sustained if international law is respected without exception, without double standards, and without selective interpretations. The events of January 3rd constitute a flagrant violation of the UN Charter perpetrated by the US government, in particular the violation of the principle of sovereign equality of states, of the absolute prohibition of the use or threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, as enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4, and a violation of the duty to settle disputes by peaceful means. Similarly, these acts also seriously violate the Geneva Conventions and its protocols, as indiscriminate attacks were carried out against the civilian population and assets. International human rights law has also been violated, particularly the right to life, personal integrity, and security. Of particular seriousness is the kidnapping of the President of the Republic by the government of the United States of America, which constitutes a direct violation of an essential norm of the international legal order, namely the personal immunity of heads of state in office. This immunity is not an individual privilege. It is an institutional guarantee that protects the sovereignty of states and the stability of the international system. Its disregard not only affects Venezuela, but also sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all states represented in this chamber, regardless of their size, power, or alliances. Mr. President, General Assembly Resolution 3314 clearly defines as an act of aggression the bombing of the territory of one state by the armed forces of another state, as well as the invasion or occupation, even without formal annexation. The events we are denouncing here unequivocally fit this definition. In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as the judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this U.S. aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure. When force is used to control resources, impose governments, or redesign states, we are faced with a logic that harks back to the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. Accepting such a logic would mean to open the door to a deeply unstable world in which countries with greater military capacities can decide by force the political and economic destinies of other states. This scenario not only threatens Venezuela, it threatens international peace and security as a whole. If the kidnapping of a head of state, the bombing of a sovereign country, and the open threat of further armed action are tolerated or downplayed, the message sent to the world is a devastating one, namely that the law is optional and that force is the true arbiter of international relations. Venezuela firmly believes in diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence among nations. That has always been our historical position, and it remains so today, even in the face of an aggression of this magnitude. It is precisely that commitment to peace, the one that was violated on the 3rd of January. Therefore, Venezuela urges this Security Council to fully assume its responsibility and to act in accordance with the mandate conferred upon it by the Charter of the United Nations. In that regard, we request, A, that the government of the United States of America be demanded to fully respect the immunities of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, as well as their immediate release and safe return to Venezuela. 2, that the use of force against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela be clearly and unequivocally condemned. Thirdly, that the principle of non-acquisition of territory or resources by force be reaffirmed. And 4, that measures aimed at de-escalation, the protection of the civilian population, and the restoration of international law be adopted. Mr. President, in spite of the seriousness of the events, Venezuela would like to inform this body and the international community that its institutions are functioning normally, that constitutional order has been preserved, and that the state exercises effective control over all of its territory. In accordance with our constitution, Executive Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is being sworn in as acting President of the Republic, thereby guaranteeing institutional continuity, stability, and internal peace. We wish to convey a message of serenity, confidence, and hope to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela is a nation that believes in peace, work, and dignity. Our commitment is to diplomacy and law, and the law is firm and unwavering. We defend our sovereignty without renouncing our values. We bet on dialogue without accepting imposition. We believe in a future of coexistence, development, and mutual respect among nations. We trust that this Security Council will rise to the historic moment facing humanity and choose the path of legality, collective responsibility, and peace. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Buenos días.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, The government of the Argentine Republic values the decision and determination demonstrated by the President of the United States of America and by his government in the recent actions.
There we have it. Venezuela speak at the United Nations and, of course, speak in front of the international community at the United Nations Security Council. Among the representative statements, many points, of course, once again reiterated the bombing of territory, the violation of sovereignty alleged by Caracas, the loss of civilian and military life. But of course, the main focus on international peace and international law being the way forward in regards to this. Alison Mutler joins us now. She is a former Associated Press bureau chief in Romania. She joins us live from Bucharest. Alison, thank you very much for joining us here on News X World. Of course, it's a pleasure to talk to you here on the programme. We've just heard from the representative of Venezuela at the United Nations. Of course, once again reiterating that America cannot be the world's police force or bully and violate another sovereign nation's sovereignty. Now, among that, there was many things to unpack. What were your thoughts on Venezuela's stance? Of course, this is once again, it has reiterated the credibility of international law, questioned the credibility of international law, the credibility of the United Nations, and the fact that the United States has put itself as the world judge, jury, and executioner. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Venezuela didn't have any option other than to say this. But the United Nations is, it's a place where speeches can be made, points of view can come across, but it's whether they're followed by action. I mean, Venezuela couldn't say anything else, but you have to also look at what is happening in Caracas and how the people are reacting, and also how the vice president, who is now in charge, is behaving and what she is saying. But this is a place, it's a forum, United Nations, for strong words, if you like. But it doesn't mean they'll be followed by any action. The UN doesn't really have a lot of power, except for being a place where leaders and ambassadors can express their opinions. But I wouldn't have expected Venezuela to say anything else at all. But what counts, and this also counts the United States and also for the world, is what will happen in Caracas, what will happen in Venezuela, not what is being said at the United Nations.
What was interesting there is that the representative likened the US actions, or I should say future US actions that Donald Trump has pitched, as colonial allegations. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine was created in order to stop the European countries from colonizing Latin America in 1823. Of course, now Donald Trump wanting to come in and has been vocal about United States oil companies coming in and mending infrastructure and also using Venezuela's oil resources for both its gain and for Venezuela's. What were your thoughts on that statement?
Well, we know that Donald Trump is prizing himself, his administration, apart from Europe to some extent. The United States still is in NATO, but they're very cool about NATO now. And Trump wants to strike it alone. He wants to be the leader of the Western Hemisphere, and that's what this capture of Maduro shows. And he wants to go back to a different world order where there were spheres of influence shared between the big powers, so in this case like China and Russia as well. So I think, and of course, it should be said that Donald Trump is a businessman. And when he talks about Ukraine, he thinks about the mineral resources. Now he's thinking about the oil in Venezuela. Obviously, he can't just go and grab it all for himself. So he says it will be shared with the great Venezuelan people. But it's very transactional for Donald Trump, and it's very important for Donald Trump to carve out a different kind of world order. And that's what he's doing. One, with these actions in Venezuela, but also with his statements on Greenland, on Canada, on Colombia.
Indeed, Alison, and of course, what does this mean for international law and the future of the United Nations also? Raymond Vickery, apologies, joins us now, an international affairs expert and former US Assistant Secretary of Commerce. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Raymond, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Let's discuss the happenings in New York concurrently. Of course, Nicolas Maduro is there facing trial. We've just heard from both Mike Waltz at the United Nations and the Venezuelan representative at the UNSC. Venezuela's allegations, of course, are that the United States broke international law in conducting this operation. What does this say for the credibility of the United Nations and, of course, of international law, the UN Charter?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It seems to me that this is a watershed moment in regard to the history of the world. You know, in the 20th century, we had two great wars caused by empires really rubbing up against one another. After that Second World War, the United Nations was formed in order to disavow the use of violence in international affairs and take a cooperative approach. The Trump administration has really withdrawn from that approach to international affairs and has made no bones about it, saying basically that it's my way or the highway to United Nations, and really going back to the 19th century view of international affairs, which is the formation of great empires. His view and the view of his administration is that the United States is entitled to its empire in the Western Hemisphere, including Latin America, Greenland, even Canada is the 51st state, but is willing to concede to others, evidently, the rights to have hegemonic relations in their areas, most notably Russia and China. It is a very, very disconcerting approach because, as in the 20th century, if this continues, the 21st century is likely to see generalized war, and with the addition of nuclear weapons on so many sides, it can be completely catastrophic. What remains now is to see what is a way forward. And the way forward is for other democracies, great democracies like India, in Western Europe and Japan, to get back to the principles of the United Nations and not just sit on the sidelines and say, well, somebody else is going to do it. Somebody else is going to uphold international law. But basically, I'm going to take the same approach that the Trump administration is. I'm going to protect my borders from immigrants and from invasion. And what happens with other great powers, whether they be China or Russia or the United States, I'm just going to try to keep my head down. This is the way of imperialism. Reversion to the 19th century. It is going to end very badly, in my view, if this continues. Now, this having been said, it's not enough for India or Western European or Japanese powers to say, well, the United States won't do it, so I won't do it. You know, Madeleine Albright, my mentor, used to say that the United States is an indispensable nation in upholding the rule of law and the international system put into effect after World War II. And I am afraid, unless others were willing to step up, that prophecy comes true, and we're in for a very, very difficult time internationally.
Indeed. Alison, I want to bring you back in. And do you think we're seeing an outright power politics, where, as Venezuela did say just then, force is the true arbiter?
I think, as the previous guy said, this is a watershed moment, and as much as what happened can be disputed legally and politically and geostrategically, as it is being disputed and discussed and condemned, and others are staying muted, that the show of force is undeniable. I mean, this was a very, very carefully planned operation, months in the making. It was very well executed. I'm not talking about the morality or the ethics of it, but it was perfectly executed, and it showed how strong and how precise the United States, the operation was. It was surgically performed. You can't dispute that. But, then the question is how, as we've been talking about, how legal is this? How moral is this? Where is the world going? What's going to happen? What is the new world order? It opens a whole can of worms and a whole new discussion. And I think the shockwaves are still being felt around the world. But it was a big show of force, of strength of the United States, for sure.
I want to thank Alison Mutler and Raymond Vickery for joining me here in this discussion. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for taking the time.